Holy Gospel of Jesus Christ according to Mark. Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. On this particular day, Jesus gathered up Peter and James and John and said, "Let's go on a hike." I can hear Peter right now. "Let me guess, Jesus, we're going up a mountain?" Jesus smiles and is out the door, laughing to himself because his friends finally picked up on his affinity for mountaintops. As the others caught up with them, I don't imagine there were a lot of questions at this point because the disciples knew that Jesus was always dragging them here and there, and this was no different than any other time they had headed up a mountain, except it was. After a while of walking, they reached the mountaintop. And before they even had a chance to ask Jesus why they were there, something happened that pushed the boundaries of their reality. To us, it probably would have seemed like a scene from a movie. As Jesus was standing there right before their eyes, something happened to the way he appeared. Christian theology holds that Jesus is divine and human at the same time. And just then, the disciples got to see him in all of his unfiltered divine reality. It's like the curtain of their human perception was pulled back to reveal this other dimension of Jesus. There was a bright, glowing light around him that they could barely look at, but when they did, they noticed that there were a few others there who weren't on the hike with them. The story says it was Elijah and Moses, just suddenly hanging out with Jesus. Just 2 of the most important figures in Jewish history, having a casual conversation with Jesus, this rabbi that they were around every day. Well, Peter was so excited that he wanted to stay up there on the mountain with glowing Jesus and Elijah and Moses. He wanted to build places for all of them to stay. I mean, why go back to normal life now that they've been exposed to something like this? I've known this story for a long time. Many of you have too. But even if it's new to you, I mean, let's be honest. Who wouldn't want to have seen that? I'm kind of jealous of Peter and James and John. There are some wild stories in the Gospels, but this stands out to me as maybe more significant than we give it credit for. Whether you live in the 1st century or now, this is not the kind of thing that happens every day. No, our days are full of waking up, getting ready, working, eating, normal, mundane, everyday stuff. Fills most of our time. Every once in a while, though, something breaks through the surface and makes waves. Something stirs our emotions, and we notice a little change. Something unexpected happens, and it grabs our attention. But 9 times out of 10, eventually it fades, and normalcy moves back in. And sometimes that normalcy can get maddening. I mean, they don't call it a midlife crisis for no reason at all, right? We live for so long with the same routine and surroundings and people that sometimes we're tempted to imagine what life would be like if things were different. Whether we like it or not, we all have this tendency towards disregarding our current state of affairs and looking to something better in the future. It's especially easy to do this now as we deal with COVID. The entire world is longing for a return to some sense of normal. We're consumed with that point in the future when we'll be able to gather again and do the things we love with the people we love. Also, as much as we love to look forward to the future, sometimes, especially the older we get, we tend to reflect on the past with rose-colored glasses. And we wish we could go back to a time that was somehow better. Anything to keep us from having to deal too much with the reality of here and now. I don't really blame Peter for wanting to stay on that mountain. Things were getting stressful back at sea level. Being a follower of Jesus, it wasn't easy. There were always people crowding around and clamoring for attention, and there were always lurkers from the religious establishment creeping around trying to catch Jesus doing something or saying something wrong. It was hard to know who to trust, and sometimes it was hard even for the disciples to understand what Jesus was even saying, what he was ultimately getting at. And all this talk of his death just didn't fit with what they expected. And to suddenly have all of this blinding evidence of the divinity of Jesus on top of this mountain, and even evidence of how important he was among the great historical figures of Judaism, was overwhelming, to say the least. Like a lot of us, Peter would rather have stayed on that mountain in all the glory and assurance and peace that it brought. But like the saying goes, change is the only constant. Suddenly, the story says that a cloud descended on them, and as if they needed any more dramatic experiences, a voice boomed out from the cloud, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." And as the last words echoed off of the mountaintop, they looked around, and everything was back to normal. No more glowing, no more Elijah and Moses, no more cloud, just them and Jesus, and a long hike back to town. We call this story the Transfiguration because Jesus was transfigured or transformed up there on the mountain. The divine part of his nature was revealed in a moment that the disciples would never forget. But Jesus wasn't the only one transformed. Peter and James and John had their own transfiguration. It was one that started when Jesus first called them to follow him as disciples. It continued as they followed him in his ministry and absorbed his teachings. As they watched him that day, they were transfigured too. They were not the same going down that mountain as they were when they went up. But the transfiguration of the disciples mostly happened like it does for us. Every mundane day in and day out. As they did life together, they grew together. The more time they spent with Jesus, the more they began to be like Jesus. The more they began to talk like Jesus and act like him. They were becoming mirrors of Jesus in a way that they couldn't possibly understand as it was happening. And when it was all said and done, the Spirit of God, that same Spirit that was in Jesus, was given to them, and the reflection of Jesus in the mirror of his friends became even more convincing. And just as the divine nature of Jesus was revealed on the mountain that day, Jesus was revealed in the disciples as they became his body in the world. And the transfiguration spread like wildfire. We just don't realize how deeply we are involved in this whole story. We think it's about Jesus and the disciples, and that's it. But the transfiguration continues in us too. Humans redeemed by Christ and indwelled by the Holy Spirit, transfigured by God's grace. This word transfigured or transformed is only used a few times in the New Testament, and one of those times is in the 3rd chapter of 2 Corinthians, and it literally takes my breath away. This is what it says. And all of us, with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed, transfigured, same word, into the same image from glory to glory. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. That is what it means to be a part of the redemption of humanity through the timeless reality of Christ. All of us are caught up in this story of the transfiguration, and we are all beneficiaries of God's gift of grace. It all comes down, though, to what we do with it, how it affects our lives, and how we treat each other. The future, it can't hold our hope, and the past is just gone. The reality of our transfiguration gets worked out now, in the moment, from glory to glory. I think it was John Lennon who made this quote popular. Life is what happens when we're busy making other plans. Don't miss it. Amen.